So with all the major news that broke this week, it's easy perhaps to forget that thousands of kids still remain separated from their families down at the border and now spread around the country. But we're not going to forget that. And thankfully, thousands of people did not yesterday when they staged a protest against the family separation policy, against ICE itself, outside of a Senate office building. 600 of those women ended up being arrested. One of them joins us on the show now, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, both Congresswoman for Washington's 7th District, also first Vice Chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So amazing activism both by you and the thousands of protesters yesterday. Can you tell us a little bit about how this particular protest came together?
Yeah, it was organized by the organizers of the Women's March and also CPD Action, which is Center for Popular Democracy's Action organization. And there were over 2,500 women that were part of the rally, first to the Department of Justice, and then we're starting at the Department of Justice and then back to the Hart building. And when I got there, I was actually going just to speak, but they had 650 of them had sat down in the center of the Hart building, were not moving, were chanting and singing and really crying actually as they were thinking about the stories and the trauma and the child abuse that is being put onto children and parents who are seeking asylum by Donald Trump and his administration. And so I had gone to speak to them, but being an activist myself and having been involved in organized civil disobedience protests before, I have a deep sense of profound respect for what civil disobedience does as people put their bodies on the line. And I decided to sit down with them and to participate in the civil disobedience arrests. And so 650 were arrested. I will say that the Capitol Police was terrific. They do know how to handle these things before, from before, and they handled it very, very well. And everyone was processed, relatively quickly, but it was a lot of people. And I think it just goes to show how, as you said, it's easy for things to slip off the radar because there are so many abuses, and we have a lot to work on, from ensuring that the Supreme Court does not become a conservative rubber stamp for Donald Trump and Republicans, to protecting against the effects of the Muslim ban, a great, terribly discriminatory policy that the Supreme Court has allowed to stand in spite of the history we know around discrimination of populations in our country. And so it would have been easy for this to slip aside, but these women were so powerful, so courageous, so loving in their call to Donald Trump, a very clear call to end the zero tolerance, zero humanity policy, to free our children, to reunite them with their families, and to release these asylum seekers who have a legal and international human right to demand or to seek asylum. And so we're demanding that they also be released and that we go ahead and process these asylum claims. That is actually our international obligation as signatories to the International Convention on Refugees.
Well, I agree, of course. I noticed there's apparently a plan being worked on by the Trump administration now that would remove the ability to apply for asylum from anyone who crossed the border illegally, which we know is just a misdemeanor, but they're attempting to weed out a significant number of these asylum claims. I do want to talk to you though, in addition to protesting the continued separation of these families, in perhaps a larger sense, one component of this protest was the Abolish ICE movement. I believe you were the first Congresswoman to call for an end to ICE. What is the reason for wanting to eliminate ICE? What are the stakes in its removal or continuation?
Yeah, well, I have worked on immigration issues for 20 years, and there was immigration enforcement, and should be, before ICE, and there will be after ICE, because we do have immigration laws. But the fact is that ICE has become a rogue agency. It has no accountability. It has, we are spending hundreds of millions of dollars, actually billions of dollars, on ICE enforcement with absolutely no controls. That money is going out to private for-profit prisons to hold people in conditions that are absolutely abusive and intolerable. And ICE agents are acting as mass deportation forces across the country. That is the wrong approach. And so we believe that ICE as an agency should not be allowed to exist, which doesn't mean that the functions won't continue to exist. But we need to do a complete redo of how we do immigration enforcement in this country. We need to really have accountability so that we're not spending hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money on functions that are literally ripping families apart and stopping the very kinds of things that built us as a country, the ability for people to come and seek refuge. And frankly, it's hypocritical to say, well, we want to have mass deportation policies when everybody in this country understands that if we were to get rid of the immigrants in this country, undocumented and legal migration, this country would collapse. And so we want to see a fair agency that actually can be held accountable and that is more cost effective for taxpayers and is humane and does not rip families apart. So that's why we're calling for ICE to be ended and for us to go back to the drawing board in terms of how we carry out these functions and what accountability measures we in Congress have before sending hundreds of millions of dollars to ICE.
Well, it certainly looks like the movement is spreading, both in amongst citizens, but also other politicians, both candidates and elected officials signing on to the plan. So I do want to thank you both for speaking out on this issue and also being willing to put your body on the line at the protest. And thank you very much for joining us on the show today.
Well, thank you so much. And I hope all your listeners are going to turn out in the streets tomorrow. There are rallies across the country and over 400,000 people have signed up to participate. And here in Washington, D.C. at 11 o'clock, we'll be at Lafayette Square, taking it right to Donald Trump and the White House to end this inhumane, cruel, zero tolerance, zero humanity policy.
Well, I will be at the LA protest. I certainly hope to see a bunch of our listeners there. Thank you again, Congresswoman.
Fantastic.